Hello and welcome to our program. I'm Will Haynes of the Watkins Museum of History. This event is part of the 29th Annual Civil War on the Border series. Today I'm excited to speak with the author of this book that I've been reading, which has been really interesting. It's titled The Fabric of Civil War Society, Uniforms, Badges, and Flags, 1859 to 1939. There we go. And I'm delighted that the author of this book was able to join us for this event. Dr. Shay Smith Cox. So, Shay, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. Shay is assistant professor of history at Texas A&M. And this book was really fascinating because it dives into the material culture, which as a museum guy is something that I really care deeply about. And I think a lot of other people do as well. And the book helps us understand that era and its commemoration in later years through the prism of that material culture. So, Shay, I'd like to jump off by asking, what may be an obvious question, but how did you get the idea to research Civil War uniforms and other material items of the conflict? Because this is not like a common topic for an academic historian. And how exactly does one go about researching this topic?
So this was my dissertation in a little bit of a different form. I was completely chronological the first time. So with this book, it started out as a seminar paper. I was in charge of a public history exhibit called Ready to Roar out of UNLV, and we were going to work with the Mob Museum. And I was learning so much about 1920s fashion during that time period. I sat back and thought, I wonder if I can apply any of this to the Civil War, because that is my heart and my passion. So I was really excited to start digging, and I found very little in terms of what other historians had written on the topic. And I just kept going. I got really interested in the economics and the business aspects and the different the different relationships overall that were allowed to take place, and then how we see it flow through time. It has been just one of the funnest things that I've gotten to research, because you start out like everyone else, right? In an archive, looking through papers, verifying, reading all of your secondhand materials. And then the difference with this project for me is that I was actually able to start going into museums and speaking to curators, speaking to registrars, and taking a whole lot of time in these places that are behind the scenes that don't always get a whole lot of time or thought or credit. And I would like to be able to display a couple of those now. Let's see. I can pull that up. Okay.
Oh, there it goes. It popped up. All right.
Did it work?
Yes, it did.
Okay, there we go. So one of the places that I got to visit that I absolutely loved was the Confederate Relic Room in South Carolina. This is the photo credit for those, but I was able to go through places that you could see samples of handmade cloth and how diligently people had to work at getting uniforms. You can see examples of the kepi. Also within this picture, you have the Samuel Isaac Campbell and Company knapsack. Samuel Isaac Campbell and Company was one of the really, really important international relationships that took place for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Another place that was just an absolute delight to visit. Their entire curatorial and registrar staff were so wonderful and so kind. The North Carolina History Museum. The coat that you see hopefully it's just a single gray coat that you see that has black buttons. One of the most fascinating things that I learned during this whole process was that whenever it's the end of the war and you may not have any clothes left, to be able to wear home, and you have this moratorium on Confederate clothing, to where you cannot wear your uniforms anymore, you have to transform your clothes. You have to make them into something that people can um, daily use. So what they did for this specific coat was to wrap the buttons that were off official Confederate buttons in black crepe fabric. So almost like the buttons themselves were in mourning, or the jacket itself was in mourning. You also had to take off any kind of insignia on your collars and your shoulders to be able to do that.
Hmm.
I'm going to go ahead and step out of there. And hopefully that answers some of those questions.
Absolutely. I have to say, too, that wrapping buttons in crepe sounds incredibly difficult. I'm not a tailor or anything, but maybe it's simpler than it seems to me. I don't know. But clearly, yes, if that's your only clothing, you have to make do.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So that's great. So reenactors notwithstanding, most people, including historians, probably don't give a lot of attention to uniforms other than a surface examination, or more than a passing thought. And this, the significance of uniforms seems obvious and really not something that you would need to discuss. It seems like a surface level significance. But your book indicates that procuring uniforms and keeping soldiers clothed were major operations during the Civil War. So how did the U.S. and the Confederate governments go about acquiring uniforms? There are estimates of anywhere from 3 to 4 million guys that needed to be clothed during the wars, which was far in advance, and far larger than any previous American army. So how did they acquire these uniforms, and what did the uniforms tell us about the larger story of the Civil War?
Well, it's one of the things that we get whenever we are coming out of or going into this. What we need to understand is that nobody was physically ready for war. In my book, I talk about how the militias are there and they are all uniformed. But let's think about that. If everyone is wearing something different, or if we unfortunately end up wearing all the same color, how do you know who to shoot at? That sounds really terrible, but you really have to know what you're supposed to be doing, who you're supposed to be firing upon. So what happens is that for the first little bit of the war, everyone's a little bit confused. People are raising money, raising regiments, but the textile industry is not ready. The manufacturing is not there. So both sides are going to end up struggling. You're going to have both sides use homespun. You will have both sides use government manufactured clothing. I mentioned the Samuel Isaac Campbell Company a minute ago. There's also the Peter Tate Company, and another one that I speak about in the book, that for the Confederacy, due to lack of industry, what they really have to do is start looking outside. So they go to Great Britain and they get partnerships with these different companies who will take cotton, they will exchange it for uniforms or just plain cloth, also guns and shoes and like other necessities. But you have this system going back and forth across the Atlantic to raise like fully clothed an army for the Confederacy. For the U.S., it's a little bit different. You have, with the manufacturing there, it is starting to ramp up, but it doesn't really get ramped properly until 1963. So that's going to end up taking a while. And you have women in factories in both sides who are trying to make clothing. But you also have the issue of one of the most popular stories for U.S. soldiers' uniforms is shoddy in the first few months of the war, because these companies would guarantee so many uniforms and they couldn't produce them fast enough. So they're literally scraping up stuff off of the floor, piecing it together, and calling it good and shipping it over to soldiers. And within a few weeks, they don't have breeches anymore. There are holes in their clothing, and one of the most detrimental parts of that is the fact that those men paid for their clothes.
Mm.
US soldiers have always had to pay for their clothing. And so whenever you're paying anywhere from $9 to $16 to $25 for a uniform, that is a whole lot of money that you don't always, I mean, you can go into debt to the government to be able to fight in a war to pay for your clothing, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned a little bit about women being involved in uniform production, but your book isn't just about uniforms, and women performed other things in the war as well, or other duties in the war as well. So what roles did women specifically play in the manufacturing of uniforms, flags, and badges? Could you tell us some more stories about that?
Sure. So during the war itself, women are deeply involved in on both sides for raising funds
Mhm.
for uniforms. They are crafting them themselves, especially in the Confederacy. Women are often running the blockade, whether just for private purposes to get their husband garments or a custom tailored uniform, or they are on ships running the blockade to
Mhm.
go get more materials to help perpetuate the war effort. Um, they're also making flags. So
Mm.
everything from piecing them together to creating sewing circles. There were a bunch of really touching stories of women in communities across both the US and the Confederacy who would get together as they are about to send their brothers and fathers and husbands off to war, who have stitched a beautiful flag, hand painted on this silk, and given it to them as a gift.
Mhm.
And we're gonna see this perpetuated many times. And this is not just talking about white women either. African American women, especially in the Northeast, that is a very, very popular um, occurrence for them. Whenever we're coming into contact with USCT soldiers,
Mhm.
they are the women who raise the money and the funds for them and help sew the uniforms, and then also create these lovely flags. Those flags mean something special and something just a little bit different, and like the uniforms that are sent that way. Whenever it comes to badges, women are more involved in the post-war aspect, and I
Mm.
can get into that in just a few minutes.
Sure. And you mentioned the flags, and just first of all, just for our audience and some people who aren't aware, what are the USCTs?
The United States colored troops will
Right.
be the USCT soldiers. So once we have the Emancipation Proclamation go through January 1st of 1863, Black men are actually legally allowed to enlist in the Army.
Mhm.
Or in the armed forces. So many will go to the Navy, but you have lots of infantry troops. And so there are stations all around the country where recruitments are happening. And these soldiers, whether they are freedmen to begin with, formerly enslaved but have been freed, and then formerly enslaved who have recently self emancipated, rush to join the US Army and to be involved in the war effort.
Yeah, and thank you for explaining that. And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there like one or two particularly well-known artists that would paint some of the flags for the U.S. colored troops? Like I'm thinking there's a really striking one that shows like one of them like stabbing a Confederate officer with his bayonet and things
Yeah,
like
I
that.
cannot
Mm.
remember his name at this moment in time, but yes, there
Yeah.
many regiments actually had these very striking
Mhm.
symbols painted on their flags, just like the USCT soldiers starting to bayonet a Confederate soldier, to another one where a USCT is standing with Columbia and preparing and readying for war. And then there are also paintings where you see the transition from an enslaved man to a USCT soldier, and the change that happens physically in the posture and the clothing and what that clothing means to the black men who are able to wear it.
Yeah. And you don't see that kind of imagery very often in the flags for the white regiments, do you?
We do not.
No, that's very unique. Yeah. So there's some images that really struck me in your book, and I'll try to see if I can share screen and show one or two of them. So the one in the front here is a man who is identified as Jefferson Shields,
Yes.
and he's wearing what looks like, an incredible weight of medals on his front. What's the story behind him?
So Jefferson Shields is a man who the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the United Confederate Veterans co-opted to be part of their story in the end. So we go from not having any Black Confederate troops, because no Black Confederate troops fought, to moderately being okay with Black men showing up in Confederate memorial societies, to full blown, we're going to take what I consider to be tokens from what I have read and understood, specific men who they now call Black Confederates, and we're going to dress them in full United Confederate veteran uniform. We're going to give them so many badges. Just place them on their chests and all over their body. And really what they're doing, that's one of the most important things about material culture, specifically from this time period, is they knew exactly what they were doing by putting a uniform on that body, putting a badge on that body. Because in the war, you decide the colors, you decide the cut, you know what infantry, like what badges you have, if you're artillery, if you are infantry, if you're cavalry, you have all of these markings to tell you exactly who you are. And the same is in the post-war period. They claim these men and these bodies to specifically state that they are Black Confederates, because what they're trying to do is they're going back through and rewriting the lost cause narrative to make themselves look a whole lot better. And it's so easy to do that if you've got material culture to back you up.
Yeah. So I jumped us forward in time to the post-war era because I was just really struck with that image. But yeah, so we'll get back to that here in a minute, perhaps. So you talked a little bit about African Americans who supposedly were these Black Confederates, right? According to the lost cause myth post-war. But during the war and on both sides, what special significance did uniforms hold for African Americans?
So uniforms were really important for African American people because it was a symbol of citizenship. It is a symbol of personhood. Many people who study antebellum slavery history, you go through and you see photographs or paintings of enslaved people. What happens to a body when they are because of the laws that were put into place, that enslaved people could only wear a certain type of clothing. It had to be these colors. It had to be these cuts. Laws on the books state they regulate their bodies. So whenever you are able to put on a uniform that is the exact same thing as a white soldier, it changes your mindset. It changes the idea of the African American people who see you. It also elicits very terrifying reactions from Confederates and also other U.S. troops. They were not always very kind or just even nonviolent toward these men, but putting these uniforms on these bodies was very, very important. And something else I wanted to go back to, because I unfortunately really love the whole economics concept, is that think about if you were an enslaved person, you self-emancipate, you run to union lines, you are able to join the military, you have no clothing. What are you going to do? you have to get clothing from the US government. You want to look like everyone else. It means so much to you as a citizen and as a person to be able to transform yourself. But there are African American men who die in service in debt to the US government because they're paid less than the white counterparts and they were allotted a different amount of clothing.
Wow. So now the story is somewhat different for indigenous soldiers, isn't it? Could you tell us more about their experiences with uniforms and material culture?
So indigenous troops are going to have a different because of the difference in Confederacy and US. Indigenous troops are going to have a different experience. Not even all on one side are you going to have the same experience. So one of the really wonderful places I got to visit was the Oklahoma Historic Society. They have a wonderful research facility. So I was able to go through some of Stan Wade's papers and diaries, who was a Cherokee man who fought for the Confederacy. One of the interesting things that you can read in his papers is being asked, asking over and over and over again, can we have clothing? What does this mean? For indigenous people in Oklahoma, in Indian Territory, what this is going to mean to them is almost the same for African American. It's citizenship. It's a covenant of we are within the circle. We are safe within the Confederacy. For the U.S. troops that are there, I read several accounts of where they are viciously made fun of by other people because they are given some clothing, but their clothing doesn't fit. So you can see in how the garb is passed out as to where the priorities lie, and what is taken specifically for indigenous people is often second rate. One fascinating story out of the Kansas Historical Society, they have this really wonderful hat that whenever it got wet, would go cone shaped. But whenever indigenous people would only be able to get pieces, what they would do is customize it for themselves. Feather, horsehair, some type of braiding or beading. And so their bodies would belong to the government by being claimed that way, but they would still retain a part of themselves.
That's interesting. Were you talking about the black army hat, like the tall black hat? Yeah. You're right. Now that you mention it, I have seen photos of Native American troops and other, I think actually like maybe some chiefs and people like that, and they have that hat and they've made it their own. They've customized it. That's really fascinating. Yeah. So to go into the post-war era, your book goes into detail. In fact, I believe about a third of it is actually in the post-war era, which I was excited to see because, of course, most Civil War books don't delve into that arena. So you talk a lot about the significance of material culture post-war in veterans reunions and in Reconstruction and the Lost Cause movement. So what can uniforms and badges help us understand about these post-war movements?
So I am going to try to share my screen again so we can take a look at some of those photos. Oops, hang on.
There we go. All right.
I don't think, there we go. All right, so let's just start with here. If you don't mind having a conversation with me, that would be great. So what do you notice about this photo?
I see men in dark suits on the left, clearly older men, and other older, similarly aged men on the right in light-colored suits, shaking hands across the wall. And I'm assuming, based on the context and because I've seen this photo before, that this is a reunion of Union and Confederate vets. And you're just looking at the photo and not your caption, they seem to be getting along pretty well.
Right. That's the iconic look that we think of whenever we think of U.S. soldiers and Confederate soldiers, right? We think of blue, we think of gray. And it's because of these photos that I became really fascinated with. Well, I know the first part of the story. We obviously all didn't look correct. There were so many supply chain issues. There were so many different colors. People were stealing things off of dead bodies and dyeing them a different color. How on earth do we get solid blue and solid gray? And that's how we get this is the fascinating part for me, is that this entire idea is rewritten. This is the Gettysburg 1913 50th anniversary image. What you can also see in the difference of colors, shaking hands across the wall, there is a badge. Like, there are badges that you can see on there, which are reunion badges and commemorative badges. I will come back to that because they were amazing. We end up with veterans' uniforms. This is one of the most interesting and most important things that comes into shaping our understanding of the Civil War, because the creation of memory started immediately. And it was detailed and specific, done, calculated on purpose. In my book, I call them the memory machines. So you have the Grand Army of the Republic, which gets to go first. You have the Women's Relief Corps, which is incorporated a little bit later. And so the Grand Army of the Republic is created in 1866, so immediately after the war. The Women's Relief Corps is created in the 1870s, but not incorporated until the 1880s, which means that they are not officially recognized by the GAR until later, even though they're doing a whole lot of service for them. You have the United Confederate Veterans, who are incorporated after the Women's Relief Corps, and then the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who are created in 1894. So what their mission is, because we have such a messy, true history, let's figure out how to clean up our history and clean up our narrative. And they start by creating veterans uniforms. They are incorporated for the GAR. I think it's in the 1880s. Officially, people start really getting into them and like having a solid idea of what they look like then. Let me see if I can go back. There we go. So one of the main people who will do this is for the Grand Army of the Republic will be the MC Lilly and Co. out of Columbus, Ohio. And you have little booklets, pamphlets that are sent out to show the pricing and the cuts. And many of those actually do have fabric in the back that you're allowed to, so you can see the difference in the weights of the fabric. These can be extremely expensive. So they'll end up being around $25, $30 then, which will translate to over $800 today. So thinking about people sinking that much money into this is quite fascinating. For the Confederacy, you have the Levy Brothers outfitters out of Kentucky, but also there are several manufacturing portions for them throughout the U.S. But here are a couple examples that are on my collection of uniforms. So we have a GAR, which is an MC Lilly and Company uniform, and then this is a homemade one. And it is a little bit different. It's a whole lot rougher, and it's made out of other things. It's missing its pockets. But it is a very strong attempt at a United Confederate veteran uniform. Stop screen share for a minute.
All right, excellent. So Shay, I think anyone interested in the material culture of history should pick up your book. Again, the title of the book is The Fabric of Civil War Society, Uniforms, Badges, and Flags, 1859 to 1939. It's fascinating work, pretty unique work, I think, and it was just a delight to read. And I don't mind sharing, I mentioned this to Shay before we started recording, and I don't mind sharing with our audience. I actually use this work in my own research for an exhibit we have at the Watkins Museum about flags. So thank you for that. All right. So, well, thanks again for joining us today, Shay. And I really appreciate you taking time during the first week of classes.
Yes, of course.
All right. Well, and thank you to all of you out there for joining us today. And bye for now.